Welcome, everybody. I think we'll get started. Thank you so much for making it out today in this freezing cold weather. My name is Gabriel Bravo. I'm the director of the NYU Reynolds Program in Social Entrepreneurship. We're the organization that is sponsoring this event and this speaker series. Before we formally get underway, I just wanted to take a couple of minutes to tell you a little bit about the Reynolds Program and why we're particularly excited about today's event. As many of you might know, especially you sort of repeat speaker series customers, the Reynolds Program funds, attracts, and encourages graduate and undergraduate students from across NYU who either want to realize a particular vision of social change or help other people to realize whatever their vision is. And I think one of the things that makes our program unique, and one of the things that we've contributed to the larger social entrepreneurial community, is this notion of multiple change-making roles. So in our program, we attract, it seems, three distinct but equally important types of change makers. One is the traditional pattern-breaking visionary that most of us are familiar with. These are folks from all different disciplines: law, medicine, dentistry, business, public policy, social work, that see a hole in the social fabric, develop an innovative, sustainable, and scalable way to fix that hole, and then are kind of obsessively, compulsively driven to realize their vision, and they sort of don't stop until their solution is the new paradigm for addressing that issue. A second type of change maker that we attract, and one that I don't think gets as much play, are the folks who build and sustain the infrastructure that's required for these ideas to take root and flourish. So these are the accountants and the lawyers and the administrators and the MIS folks that help the visionary realize whatever their particular vision is. And I also think it includes folks who build and promote the social entrepreneurial field itself. A third type of change maker that we attract to the program are those folks that are kind of involved in the advocacy side, people who want to spur others to action through media and the arts. So these are the television producers, the documentary filmmakers, the photographers, the playwrights that tell the stories of social entrepreneurs and in so doing inspire other people to get involved. I'm touching upon this now because I think our speaker today, Cheryl Dorsey, is a great example of that power, of the power of that second type of change maker. Under her leadership, Echoing Green has literally launched the social entrepreneurial careers and funded and supported and helped to network hundreds of fledgling change makers, and in so doing helped to unleash their own vision. They in turn have impacted thousands, if not tens of thousands, if not more lives. So it's, I think it's a really great example, and very thrilled to have her with us today. What I'd like to do now is invite to the podium Lauren Gunderson. She's a 2007 Reynolds Fellow studying dramatic writing at Tisch School of the Arts, and she'll have the honor of formally introducing Cheryl today. Okay.
Thank you, Gabe. Welcome, everyone, to the latest installment of the NYU Reynolds Program's Social Entrepreneurship in the 21st Century Speaker Series. I'm Lauren Gunderson, and I'm a 2007 Reynolds Fellow studying at Tisch School of the Arts, as Gabe just said. We are thrilled to have Cheryl Dorsey with us today. Cheryl, who, as you know, is the president of Echoing Green, is a true social entrepreneur, and that she proves that the social part of that title is just as important as the entrepreneur part. Echoing Green supports ideas from across the social spectrum of emerging changemakers, from civil rights activists to education reformers, environmentalists to public defenders, healthcare and housing providers to artists, the last of which is my personal calling as a Reynolds Fellow studying dramatic writing, where I combine arts and activism. Cheryl and Echoing Green know that diversity of action and ideas is the best chance to elevate the whole of our society, not just a piece of it at a time. Echoing Green has been in the business of identifying, funding, and supporting emerging social entrepreneurs since 1987. They've provided critical support to the folks that founded Teach for America, City Year, Genocide Intervention Network, and International Bridges to Justice, just to name a few. Echoing Green considers themselves active investors, not just providing funding to their fellows, but also helping them achieve their maximum potential through a range of support services, including training, networking opportunities, consulting, and lifelong championing. Cheryl Dorsey is the president of this incredible organization, and it is my pleasure and honor to introduce her today. An accomplished social entrepreneur with expertise in healthcare, labor issues, and public policy, Cheryl Dorsey was named president of Echoing Green in May 2002. She is the first Echoing Green Fellow to lead this global nonprofit, which has awarded more than $27 million to startup capital to over 450 social entrepreneurs worldwide since its founding. In 1992, while training to be a pediatrician at Harvard Medical, she received an Echoing Green Fellowship. With it, she launched the Family Van, a community-based mobile health unit that provides basic health care and outreach services to at-risk residents of inner-city Boston neighborhoods. Cheryl also received her MPP from John F. Kennedy School of Government, and as a public policy innovator, Cheryl served as a White House Fellow from 97 to 98, serving as Special Assistant to the U.S. Secretary of Labor, advising politics is politics, advising the Clinton administration on health care and other issues. She was later named Special Assistant to the Director of the Women's Bureau of the U.S. Labor Department, where she helped develop family-friendly workplace policies and spearheaded the Labor Secretary's Pay Equity Initiative. Cheryl has received numerous awards and honors for her commitment to public service, including the Pfizer Roaring History of Medicine Award, the Robert Kennedy Distinguished Public Service Award, and the Manuel C. Carballo Memorial Prize. Cheryl, from the NYU Reynolds Program and the NYU community at large, welcome.
Lauren, thank you for that lovely introduction. I really appreciate that. Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for coming out this morning. I think we've got plenty of time for Q&A after my remarks, and that's why I enjoy doing this, because it's in conversation and in dialogue where I think we sort of get to the most interesting part of these sorts of things. I want to start by thanking my host, Gabe, and the Reynolds program. We've had a long and good relationship. I was very honored and fortunate the year that I think Reynolds was starting to serve as a selection judge for maybe the first class of Reynolds Fellows, and really enjoyed the process, and actually continue to stay in touch with one or two of the program's fellows. So congratulations for being a Reynolds Fellow. It's a terrific program, and I think it's a real testimony to how this field has really grown and expanded. So I think it's a vindication for those of us who, 6 or 8 or 10 years ago, when you said social entrepreneurship, nobody knew what the heck you were talking about. So that's really terrific. I also want to recognize some folks from the Echoing Green family. So a bunch of my colleagues are in the room. So can Echoing Green folks raise your hand? We've got a good turnout, and Laura, my colleague up front, is not raising her hand, but thank you all for coming. And we also have Echoing Green leadership in the room. Where's Nozo? Nozo, who is a member of our development committee, who's been an important leader of our community. Thank you for coming, Nozo, so appreciate it. And before I jump in, I always like to talk about the ties that bind. And NYU has been a really rich community for Echoing Green over the years, because we funded a significant number of NYU grads from across the university doing really great work. So I just want to acknowledge a couple of them. So some of you may be familiar with Una Chatterjee. She graduated from the law school. She co-founded Make the Road by Walking, which recently merged with the Latin American Integration Center and is now called Make the Road New York, doing economic justice work in Bushwick, Queens, and Staten Island, and through the recent merger has now become one of the largest unions in the city of New York, so doing terrific work. Also a more recent NYU Law School grad, Preeti Radhakrishnan, who with her husband started IMAC, which is an acronym for Initiative for Medicine, Access, and Knowledge, which is creating a new model of public interest law that brings together lawyers and scientists to ensure that patents don't obstruct people's access to affordable medicines in developing countries. We also funded a terrific social entrepreneur, Gary Field, graduated from the School of Social Work, was the founder of Career Gear, which is a national workforce development program for men. I mean, I'm sure most people are familiar with Dress for Success and other initiatives for poor women trying to get back into the workforce. Rarely is there attention on disadvantaged men, but Career Gear was one of those first initiatives that worked on job retention and career advancement opportunities for low-income and disadvantaged men in New York. And finally, Risa Wilson, I think she was MFA, she got her MFA here at NYU, started the Laundromat Project. You'll appreciate this, Lauren, she's an artist who's working in Bed-Stuy, and the Laundromat Project uses the space of local coin-operated laundromats to provide communities of color with broad access to visual art as a tool for personal and social transformation. So some very cool, opportunities that have come to Echoing Green from the NYU community. And just to sort of make these examples real, we also have a 2008 Echoing Green fellow in the room. Rafa, where are you? So Rafa Cancel Vasquez, who came to us from Puerto Rico. I'm sorry you got the worst weather ever, because he said it was 70-something when he left Puerto Rico. But Rafa was funded by Echoing Green in 2008 to start the National Environmental Law Association. It is Puerto Rico's very first environmental law center. So we're really excited that Rafa could be with us today. And again, terrific social entrepreneur that I hope some of you will get a chance to talk with after I finish. So I'm going to just give you a quick overview of what I'm going to be talking about, I guess, in the next 50 minutes or so. I think I'm going to start by talking about the field, some assumptions and some of the tensions that I see in the field of social entrepreneurship and how they're sort of playing out in this day and time. Then I'm going to move on to how Echoing Green fits into that larger landscape of the field and really sort of delve into our particular model of social entrepreneurship. And then finally, I want to talk to you all about some of the things that we at Echoing Green have learned about the qualities and behaviors of social change agents after working, as Gabe said, with close to 500 of them over the years. After doing it for 20 years, you really get good at pattern recognition and sort of sussing out trends and things that make these very interesting social change agents tick. And I think you guys will find this part of my talk particularly interesting, as I believe many of these observations are more generally applicable and may be useful to a lot of you who are interested and engaged in the social sector. So I'll start with the field. So, and I'm doing sort of a disclaimer, and I hope I don't bore some of you. I'm sort of a frustrated and failed academic, so anytime I get to come to a university, I love sort of talking about stuff as it relates to academics and how you translate some theoretical knowledge to the realm of the practitioner, which I am. So bear with me, but I think it's particularly interesting. So I think you guys are pretty familiar with social entrepreneurship and the various definitions of social entrepreneurship. So it's everything from individuals with innovative solutions to society's most pressing social problems, or as David Bornstein might say, society's change agents, or visionaries who generate innovations with the potential to transform a problem or a field, or drivers of social innovation and transformation. So I gave you those various definitions because when you sort of start to unpack those terms and you sort of look at it from a sociological perspective, this is a really quite deterministic view of social change. And what do I mean by that? I mean, it really privileges this notion of direct causation, in many ways the prime movers theory of change, so that factors such as strong leadership are causal and are really implicated on the leading edge of driving change. But it's very interesting when you sort of look at examples across fields as disparate as, history of science, anthropology, the science of complexity, and even management theory. It becomes very clear that the process of change is not quite so linear, and it's actually not so much about individual causal vectors. So let me give you a couple of examples of what I mean by that. So let's start with some history. So there's a very famous 20th century British historian called Arnold Toynbee, who wrote a seminal book, or I think it's 12 books, so a volume of books, called The Study of History, where he did exhaustive studies of about, I think, 30 different civilizations. And in studying the rise and fall of these civilizations and looking at them when they reached their peak, he sort of watched when they tended to lose their cultural momentum and began that process of decline. And he noted that, in this period of decline, these civilizations don't actually completely lose their ability to respond to changes, which interestingly is Toynbee's definition of creativity. So creativity is equal to a society's ability to respond to change. And he actually started to look at what happens when the cultural mainstream gets ossified, it starts to cling to fixed beliefs and ideas, exhibits very rigid patterns of behavior. Groups that he calls creative minorities, social entrepreneurs, start to appear on the scene and carry on the challenge, on the process of challenge and response, give and take, back and forth. And you'll notice that dominant social institutions will refuse to hand over their leading roles to these new cultural forces, these creative minorities, but they will inevitably go on to decline, and these creative minorities may actually be able to transform some of the old elements into a new configuration. So let's move it a little closer to my neck of the woods. In college, I was a historian of science, and I got in my sophomore year, the bane of my existence was Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions. I spent so many nights with caffeine and trying to figure out what the hell he was talking about, but many say it's arguably the most important book of the 20th century. And the thing for everyone here to remember is that in Kuhn's book, he was the one who introduced the concept of a paradigm, and I think, Gabe, you were talking about paradigm in your opening remarks. So a paradigm is a conceptual model, a set of assumptions about reality that allows, in this case, scientists or researchers to elaborate theories, to gather data, and to solve problems. So as long as that, existing paradigm explains most observed phenomena and solve most of the problems most people want solved, it remains dominant. However, as new phenomena start to pop up and start to contradict that existing paradigm, the paradigm begins to succumb to doubt. And when a new paradigm is finally articulated, when you have these little pockets of doubt, that's when a new paradigm is articulated, and that's when a paradigmatic shift happens. So for Kuhn, through the lens of the history of science, he really tells us that, history of science is not linear at all. It's really about rational progress. It really is about moments of radical shifts of vision. So, and in fact, this is my favorite example. I found this fascinating. There is a writer named Scott London who has a great paper that talks about, various change theories and what they tell us. He gives a great example of how this pattern plays out in the natural world. And he looks at the work of a biologist, Dr. Elizabeth Sahtouris. So Dr. Sahtouris studied the metamorphosis of the caterpillar into the butterfly. And she looked at the metamorphosis process, and she said, there are small cells in the caterpillar called imaginal discs. So these imaginal discs begin to appear in the body of the caterpillar, but since they're not recognized by the caterpillar's immune system, they're immediately wiped out, they're destroyed. But as they grow in number, and there are more and more of these imaginal discs begin to line up and link up, they ultimately will overwhelm the caterpillar's immune system. And it is at that time that the body goes into full meltdown, and the imaginal discs then build the butterfly from the spent materials of the caterpillar. See, again, I love this example because I think it shows in really cool biological, natural terms what all of this change theory stuff is about. And so, let's look back at what I just talked about related to Thomas Kuhn. So you could actually look at those imaginal discs as the anomalies that Kuhn talks about in his model of paradigmatic change, right? So the caterpillar's immune system doesn't recognize these discs, just as the dominant paradigm in Kuhn's model fails to account for anomalies. And finally, they both overwhelm the system and usher in a new phase, or social change. And similarly, we can also relate this back to the historian Toynbee's work that I talked about first. So compare these imaginal discs to creative minorities. So the seeds of a new civilization are contained within the old one, just like the blueprint of the butterfly is contained within the cells of the caterpillar. So these are just a few examples, and I'm going to stop here because I know I'm probably boring half of you, but I find it fascinating, and I think it's very interesting to reach into academic research to sort of test our assumptions in the world of practitioners, where we're just trying to figure out and make sense of what we do. But again, these are just a few examples of the growing evidence that, in fact, systemic change is not mechanistic, it is not progressive, and it's not a linear phenomena whose causes and effects can be clearly isolated. So then what does this all really mean for social entrepreneurship and people like me who run a social entrepreneurial organization? So, you know, this notion of, you know, the centrality of interrelationships, mutuality, change in dynamic systems, it's actually a very real tension that is playing out in my field at the moment, because when you sort of listen very closely to some of the social entrepreneurial leaders, it sounds a whole lot like sort of the great men of history argument, that explanation of change. And you might ask me, you know, where does echoing green sort of fit into that tension? Is it sort of about this dynamic relationship, interrelationships, that mode of change, or sort of the you know, univectorial notion of change? I'm actually going to totally whiff on this question and say that, you know, echoing green actually straddles both of these ideas fairly well. And let me show you how we do it. So in fact, I think Echoing Green's approach to social entrepreneurship really does operate very effectively from this middle ground, recognizing both a systems-based approach to change as well as the unique role that individuals like social entrepreneurs play in helping to drive social change. So I'm going to make 3 points about how we, Echoing Green, view social entrepreneurial leadership. So first, our brand of social entrepreneurial leadership is very much about the identification of social movement, or what I call movement-conscious social entrepreneurs. So as I've already stated earlier in my talk, we believe that social change is really a long-term dynamic proposition. I believe societies are inherently conservative. They operate somewhat from a zero-sum perspective. So you have social change really does happen when actors, whether they be individuals, whether they be organizations, when these actors push against and try to reset norms, rules, normative constraints, and start to negotiate for what I call the new normal. So thus, you know, the new idea test that is so fundamental to our field is for us not so much about innovation, but rather about signaling an inflection point in a particular movement, or a resetting or a shift that's happening in a particular social movement. So in a sense, when you look at Echoing Green and how we go about picking these social entrepreneurial leaders, we are really in the business for looking at that next generation leader, that next generation of leader, you know, who's on the cutting edge, on the vanguard of a particular social movement, and who is really bringing to the fore a new way of doing business. The second point I want to make about social entrepreneurial leadership comes from Malcolm Gladwell. So I know everybody, Tipping Point, Blink, Outliers, which I just finished reading, which was such a great book, who's really one of my favorite societal observers, who made a really important point in his first book, The Tipping Point, where he noted that social change is typically brought about not by people with great political or economic power, but by people with great social power. So these were Gladwell's Connectors, right? So these connectors are people who are part of an unusually large number of social circles who can bring disparate groups together. And this really hints at the collective action and mobilization of sufficient resources that are necessary for all social movement progress. And, you know, it's interesting, my colleagues at Echoing Green, we will often look at Echoing Green fellows like Rafa and others who are really quite good bridge builders. They're in the business of reaching across various communities and bringing them together, and it's in that reaching out that they are able to collectivize and mobilize large amounts of human capital for their particular social cause or issue. Okay. So then the last thing I want to talk about in regards to social entrepreneurial leadership is this idea of the relationship of sustained behavior change. I believe that behavioral change and long-term behavioral change is another necessary condition for social change and for successful social movements. Echoing Green really does recognize both the hard work that our social entrepreneurs organizations do to facilitate lasting behavior change in the communities they serve, but also, and I really want to underscore this piece, and this speaks to the work that you're doing, Gabe, that the really important role that the social entrepreneur himself or herself plays as leaders who motivate and inspire others to act in new and different ways. So you were talking about doing dramatic writing. if I'm not doing Echoing Green, I'm usually watching TV. And I was up at 1 in the morning watching an old Oprah episode the day after the inauguration. And she had Gail was there, and Forrest Whitaker, the actor, was there, and John Bon Jovi, and Doris Kearns Goodwin, who I love, the historian. So I thought, said the most beautiful thing when she was talking about Lincoln vis-a-vis President Obama, and she talked about the magic of leadership and how it is the magic of leadership that reaches down to people's self-definition and changes it. I mean, I just love this conception because I actually think this ability of the social entrepreneur through example, through word and through deed, to get other people to look and reflect and then ultimately change themselves, I actually think that that's one of the most important contributions that social entrepreneurs will ever make to society. This is a catalytic role, it is a reflective role, and again, this idea of social entrepreneurs, through their example, helping other people see themselves in new and more powerful ways. That's how we get to a society, millions and millions of engaged change makers. So I'll stop there with these models of social entrepreneurial leadership that I think Echoing Green looks most specifically at. And then I want to spend the last couple minutes of my talk talking about something that I think will be really relevant and of interest to most of you here. So as Lauren or Gabe or both said, that Echoing Green has been around, 21 years now. We funded close to 500 social entrepreneurs working in 40 different countries. I think we're up to 42 different states around this country. And again, after doing that year in and year out, you get really good at pattern recognition, at talent identification. And recently Echoing Green took a step back and really said, we've got this really great ability to spot and pick social entrepreneurial talent. We're just really good at it. And as a result of that particular skill set, that currency, we have amassed a tremendous insights over these past couple of decades about what we think it takes to identify with a high degree of certainty the successful Echoing Green Fellow. We internally are now calling this constellation of characteristics and traits seen across our Echoing Green community, whether it's, Rafa doing environmental law in Puerto Rico, or Mark Levine, who started the first credit union up in Washington Heights, or Sarah Horowitz, if you ride the subway and see the Freelancers Union posters providing portable benefits for today's contingent and contractual and part-time workforce. They actually all have a constellation of traits and qualities that are eerily similar, despite the program areas in which they work. So we are calling this package, this constellation of traits, SEQ, or social entrepreneurial quotient. And for those of you who read psychology or like Daniel Goleman, it is clearly a play on Daniel Goleman's concept of EQ, or emotional intelligence. And Echoing Green started developing this notion of SEQ as our own behavioral model, because it allows us to start in a very methodological, rigorous way to start selecting the folks who ultimately go on to be Echoing Green Fellows. And it's been really, and again, we're not at the point of having SEQ ready for prime time. And I think this is actually the first time I'm talking about it publicly, so you get a bit of a scoop on SEQ. But for us, it's really providing us with a new way of understanding and assessing successful social change agents. And I just want to quickly walk through and tell you sort of the 8 characteristics that we've identified, bless you, that we think in concert define an extraordinary social entrepreneur. Okay, so the first characteristic or trait is something for now we're calling core identity formation and alignment. And I think that's a bit of a buzz term, but essentially it's really about authenticity. And these social entrepreneurs really knowing their values, really understanding and knowing and accepting their purpose, and really understanding themselves. And, this is really, really hard to do. This is, you got to go deep and face your fears. You got to recognize and come to grips with your weaknesses when all along you guys in school are being touted for your strengths. You've got to understand what path you're going to take, and it's partly about loss and grief because it means you'll leave other paths behind. This is really tough stuff. And I'm, really convinced that most of the problems of the world are because most of us never get to that point. We never get to that point of being in the zone where we know who we are and what we were placed here to do, and we are fueled by it every day. So, in fact, the example that I'm going to use is me. So, again, at 45, I, wish I knew now what I knew 20, 25 years ago. I would have been spectacular. It would have been great, but I didn't. But it was a journey, and I'm just thankful I got to where I am today. And, I'm not an athlete. I'm a total couch potato, watch television 4 or 5 hours a day. But I understand, I think, what athletes talk about when they say they are in the zone. I think along with so many of our social entrepreneurs, are in the zone in terms of working for the issue that we so deeply believe in, bringing in the skill set that uses our best and highest use. So what is it for me? So as Lauren introduced me, trained as a pediatrician, I have a degree in public policy, worked for the Clinton White House, just spent the past 3 months volunteering for the Obama transition on their social innovation agenda. That doesn't mean anything. My sweet spot, who I am, is actually, I'm a cultural translator. And it took me a long time to understand that is what I do better than anything else. So what do I mean by a cultural translator? So I'm a kid who grew up the daughter of 2 public school teachers. My parents were pretty much the first people in their family to go to college. I was the first person in my family to go to an Ivy League school, first person in my family to be a doctor. But I am a kid of Baltimore. I am a kid of my middle class upbringing. I'm an African American in the United States. And that is who I am. It is everything. It's the lens through which I see everything. But on the other hand, I have had the great privilege and honor to have access to incredibly elite institutions and have a terrific pedigree as a result. I went to Harvard College. I went to Harvard Medical School. I went to the Kennedy School of Government. But when I was there, I spent most of my time toggling back between those very elite, exclusive institutions and the surrounding communities of Roxbury, Dorchester, and Mattapan, where I started my Echoing Green funded program, the Family Van. So, 20 years ago, black babies in Boston were dying at 3 times the rate of white babies. I mean, 3 times. And so not only is that just a terrific tragedy that our most vulnerable citizens were not even getting a start at life, but it was happening 1 block away from the best medical school in the world. It was incredible to me. And I was telling somebody last week that I remember, it was 20 years ago, but I remember it as it was yesterday. The Boston Globe did this 5-part expose called Birth and the Death Zones. And talking about this problem, like, how in a town where you've got, Brigham and Women Hospital, Mass General, Mount Auburn, these babies were dying at 3 times the rate of white babies. And again, the only difference was the color of their skin. And so, and I remember, the first article, there's this young woman in her 20s kneeling down before the grave of her baby. And and again, it still gives me goosebumps to think about it. And I just, it's at that moment, and if any of you have read the Be Bold book, with which Laura Galinsky was the driving force behind, talked about your moment of obligation. In some ways, maybe people say it sounds corny, it doesn't really happen, that only happens in movies. Well, it actually doesn't. Like, my life changed just like that. So that, to hear the stories and read the stories and see that young mother in such grief, that changed my life forever. Like, it became my responsibility to be a part of that issue, to be a part of that solution. And I knew that I would never go back after reading that story, after reading those statistics, and thus came the Family Van. But what I only learned years later was that it was part of a much larger commitment to equality of opportunity and equity. And again, my particular role, because the whole thing about social movements is it's a collective. There's not one leader. There are a host of individuals who are involved, and they bring different roles to the party, right? And again, my role, my unique qualification is that I am a cultural translator. So I am perfectly at home at a potluck dinner in an inner city community center talking about the lack of access to services or resources as I am in, the corridors of Harvard University. And that is a really specific skill. And again, I didn't identify it and I didn't understand it, the utility of it, until just a few years ago. But it has become my way of contributing to the movement that I care so deeply about, this notion of equity and equality of opportunity for all. So that's who I am. That's my best and highest use, and I get up every day continuing to use that skill set for what I hope is the betterment of my community and other communities. So that's the first thing. So core identity, who are you? What were you put here to do? The second quality that we look at is, and it's sort of similar to the first one, and I alluded to it in my example, sort of a deep, unshakable obligation to a cause. And I'm going to use another Echoing Green fellow, Van Jones, as an example. So Van Jones, was he 98, 95, 1995 Echoing Green fellow? Some of you were shaking your heads. Van Jones, extraordinary, just an extraordinary social entrepreneur. Echoing Green funded Van in 1995 to start a police hotline, an anti-brutality police hotline in Oakland, California. And he did an amazing job. Went on to found the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights that worked for economic justice, social justice, human rights in Oakland. And if any of you sort of followed the presidential campaign and are looking at the green economy, Van Jones is the chief architect of this administration's green jobs policy. It's stunning to me. It's incredible. And in fact, if you haven't read his book, Green Collar Jobs Economy, please go get it because he lays out his vision. But you can march through Van's career and you say, oh, he went from this police hotline to this Center for Human Rights in Oakland to this green jobs platform. It is absolutely consistent because when you dig through that, he has remained absolutely, his North Star continues to be his unshakable commitment to poor, marginalized, and disadvantaged communities of color across this country. And it doesn't matter how it has played out for him, whether it's through working to make the criminal justice system more fair, whether it's through human rights issues in a particular community or through this Green Jobs Initiative. It all comes back to that unshakable platform of a commitment to impoverished communities of color. And I'll stop here. There's a social philosopher named Philip Slater who wrote a great book called A Dream Deferred. And he noted, why change is so difficult. And, we all know change is hard. Like, we all get into our routines. It's sort of easier to do the same old, same old. And Slater noted that people are reluctant to change because change is uncomfortable, right? And it demands a great deal of energy. So Slater then makes the leap and says, therefore, if you start where you care the most and do what you like to do the most, that's where you will contribute the most energy and be most effective. And I think that plays out over and over again in the Echoing Green community, including Van Jones. That's the second point. The third thing that we see over and over again are that social entrepreneurs, the really good ones, are phenomenal resource magnets. They are magnificent at and have a great ability to move hearts, minds, and resources. So two examples. So I guess it was Lauren who alluded to Wendy Kopp, one of the first Echoing Green fellows, graduated from Princeton with her senior thesis in her hand about wanting to start this corps of teachers that were going to go into disadvantaged communities. And her senior thesis advisor said, this is ridiculous, good paper, but never going to work. Here we are, 20 years later, where she's got 3,500 corps members a year out working all over the country. They've got 15,000 plus alums with an annual budget. I think they're up to 100 million a year now. So what a great example of a resource magnet. And again, I want to be very careful to note, it's not just about the money. I mean, Wendy has really assembled an army of young people, like many of you, who are going on to be lifelong education reform advocates and champions. And if any of you sort of follow education reform, you know, I actually split my time between DC and New York, and the head of the DC schools, Michelle Rhee, former TFA alum. And if you read the book Forces for Good, terrific book written by two Echoing Green alums, Leslie Crutchfield and Heather McLeod Grant, in it, Wendy notes that you know, one of the next dreams for TFA is to have a TFA core member in the White House. So, I mean, she's going for it. She is all in. And I think she's a terrific example of what it means to be a resource magnet. And I'll give you just one more recent example of an Echoing Green Fellow, an amazing young man, Sasha Chanoff, who started an organization called Mapendo International, named after Mrs. Rose Mapendo, who lost her husband in the genocide. Well, she was in a Congolese, she was in the Congo, in the Congolese refugee camp. Husband was killed. Daughter was raped numerous times. Mrs. Mapendo was pregnant with two twins who were born, you know, in jail at only a couple of pounds apiece. Sasha, who was working for a humanitarian relief agency, was able to get into the refugee camp and get Mrs. Mapendo and her 9 children out and get them here to the United States. And what Sasha saw was that although we had sort of this network of humanitarian agencies working in refugee camps, they weren't responsive enough to sort of grab those most in danger of being killed or harassed. And so he stepped in, creating Mapendo International, to be essentially a quick response system to get people like Mrs. Mapendo out of harm's way before they were killed, raped in these horrific situations. And you know, we funded Sasha, was he 2006 fellow? I think that's right, 2006 Echoing Green Fellow. And in just a couple of years, he has just made significant strides. So if you go to Nairobi, Kenya, you can go to Mapendo International's new hospital with the support of people like Susan Sarandon, Olivia Dukakis, and others. He's been able to not only continue to do his refugee crisis assistance work, but also create this new institution in the slums of Nairobi, where so many thousands of refugees flow in and become nameless, faceless folks who are just trying to stay alive. And it's been really incredible to watch his progress. The next trait, and again, it goes back to, you know, the very essence of SEQ, which is that our fellows have tremendously high EQ, tremendously high emotional intelligence. They really have a deep understanding of themselves and, most importantly, of others. They're incredibly empathetic. They're able to walk in their constituents' shoes and relate in really profound, deep, and meaningful ways. You know, my best example of this is Echoing Green Fellow Eric Dawson. Wonderful, wonderful young man who started a program called Peace Games, which looked at schools across this country and saw the level of violence and bullying happening among children, and realized that until children and families started to create cultures of peace within the schools, we'd sort of never untangle all of this. So Peace Games puts workers in schools to work closely with parents and students to create cultures of peace. And you know, here's a young man who actually is still working full-time for Peace Games, but actually is also getting his divinity degree as we speak, who we almost every year bring back to the Echoing Green conferences to talk to our fellows, to really relate to them the struggles he's encountered as a social entrepreneur, where he's tripped and fallen, but how he's gotten back up. And again, his level of emotional intelligence and decency, it just continues to astound me, and is again one of the best examples I see of that trait in our community. Next thing, asset-based thinking. This is sort of a behavioral model started by the folks at the Kramer Institute, which I quite like. It sort of has 3 pillars. It talks about, you know, in this world, most of us are deficit-based thinkers, and that's sort of physiologically the appropriate thing to do, because it's fight or flight. And it makes sense to be a deficit-based thinker, because if there's a problem, you protect yourself and you sort of get out of harm's way. But in fact, by flipping the switch and being asset-based thinkers, it's really an amazing transformational model, because it focuses on opportunities rather than problems. It's sort of glass half full versus half empty. You focus on strengths more than weaknesses, and you think about what can be done versus what can't. And when I was looking for an example of this, Laura gave me just the best example. So Chris, is he a 2007 fellow? 6, 8, 6? They all run, you forget. Myers-Ash, 2006, 7 fellow. So Chris Myers-Ash, he's a TFA alum. Went back to Mississippi and ran, an after-school program for young people. And a couple years ago, looked at our system of public leadership in this country and said, we've got these 5 military academies that sort of trains public leadership. We have no equivalent to train public service leadership in this country. So he decided to start the Public Service Academy, which will be our nation's equivalent of West Point, the Air Force Academy, and essentially he wants to build a university that brings 1,300, 1,500 young people each year to Washington, D.C. for a college education, and in exchange for that free college education, they will give up to 5 years of service in our local, state, federal government apparatus. Well, this is really pretty extraordinary. This guy's got to raise an $180 million appropriation from Congress. He's got to get it through both the House and the Senate. And I marvel at this young man because he absolutely gets up every day believing he is going to do it, despite all of the tangible obstacles that would make you think, my God, in this environment, we got no money, we've got incredible partisan rancor. How is he ever going to get this done? Well, through this lens of asset-based thinking, I believe he's going to get it done. Chris absolutely believes that the Public Service Academy will be a reality one day. The last couple of, because I probably now have 8 minutes. So the next quality is our social entrepreneurs are solutions-oriented. And a great example of this is Mr. John Thompson. So John was a 2007 fellow. John spent 18 years on death row in Louisiana in Angola prison for a crime he didn't commit. Absolutely innocent. And twice came within 29 days of being executed. Again, this man was innocent, absolutely innocent. And with the support of the Innocence Project, was released from prison a couple of years ago and walked out after, again, 17, 18 years. With lost time. He was given a bus pass and walked into his new life with nothing more than that bus pass and forgiveness and his core belief that his experience would not destroy him, but he would use it to help others like him. And he started a terrific organization called Resurrection After Exoneration, which is working with other exonerees like himself, as well as long-term incarcerated men in Louisiana, to basically get their lives back on track. And here's a guy who never, I think he finished high school, again, who lost 17 years of his life for a crime he did not commit, had no knowledge of starting a nonprofit organization, and is today working in post-Katrina New Orleans with a new building, working with men to work on life skills, job development skills, workforce development skills, a real solutions orientation. The next example I'll give you, our fellows are particularly focused and have the ability to execute with alacrity. So best example I can think of is a 1998 fellow, Vikram Kula. Vikram started SKS Microfinance, for those of you who are interested in microcredit, international global development. SKS is the fastest growing microcredit institution in all of India. It's got 180% annual growth rate. To date, they're up to, I think, about 3.6 million clients. He's provided about $1.2 billion in microloans in less than 10 years. Just incredible. This is a young man who executes every single day, and it is a fascinating model of how you stay phenomenally focused, where his goal is. When I met Vikram, I met him, it's a great story, I met him in New Orleans at an Echoing Green conference, and it must have been in like 2001, and he said, hey, Vikram, Cheryl, I'm just, taking over Echoing Green, used to be a fellow, and I said, what do you do? And he said, I am going to help solve poverty in India. Said it with a straight face, no hesitation. He said, that is my job, that is what I'm committed to doing. And it is just absolutely unbelievable to me that he not only has now served 3.6 million clients, that he's got the audacious goal of getting to 5 million clients in the next year or so, and I absolutely believe he will get there. The last quality is sort of an interesting one, and wasn't necessarily so obvious on its face. And we at Echoing Green had to step back and look at it. I mean, it was I have to tell you, this was probably the most interesting part of this SEQ development exercise for me, where I essentially, spent an afternoon, the staff did a great brainstorming exercise where we, yelled out all the qualities that we see and various Echoing Green Fellows, and we just listed them on a whiteboard, and we were writing them up, and there were a ton of them. And then I remember going back and sort of starting to list them on different note cards, and a really fascinating pattern emerged, which again, I hadn't really thought about. You know, it's very clear that our fellows are really talented. They are blessed with an abundance of gifts. But interestingly, when you start to look at these qualities, many of them are in conflict. There's a duality that we see in these social entrepreneurs that, for example, you see in that same social entrepreneur sort of a very patient persona knocking up against incredible impatience at getting at, you know, solving that particular issue, or someone who is terrifically creative, but, you know, on the other hand, incredibly grounded in the work that they do. And the last example, which I like, is, you know, you see a lot of our fellows, and I think I would include myself in this, who are incredibly comfortable with being lonely in their professional lives. Because, I mean, again, a lot of these people are out on the edge. They see around corners before the rest of us get there. So they are often, you know, 3 to 5 to 8 steps ahead. So they have to develop a great deal of comfort and self-possession to be out there alone and to accept ridicule, to accept backlash, and they're okay with it. But on the other hand, they are very good at crafting very deep support networks that sustain them and rejuvenate them. So I have to say this duality is really fascinating to me, and I think there's something in here that it's this, you know, these characteristics that bump up against each other, and in that nexus of where they're bumping up against each other, that's where, you find this sweet spot, and it gives them the ability to do this really hard, lifelong, grueling, but incredibly satisfying work. So that's sort of, you know, the beginnings of SEQ. I know, you know, we will look forward to sort of getting it sort of cleaned up and packaged and getting it out there, because, again, I don't think it's unique to our social entrepreneurs. I don't think it's unique to Echoing Green social entrepreneurs. And I think, you know, some of our fellows display all of these qualities in a really high amount, others some more, some less. But I actually think there are lessons for all of us. And for those of you who are really committed and interested in social change work, either as an avocation or in volunteer form, I think there are lessons to be gleaned about how you walk in the world that help you get to a level of effectiveness for social change that I'm really excited. And I think, you know, in sort of Echoing Green 2.0, I think we have a really important role to play in sort of getting out this notion of SEQ as sort of a bridge to bring more and more people into this exercise and this work of social change. So I'm going to stop there.
Of a Q&A, and you've probably noticed the microphones here and here. If you just line up, and we'll take about half an hour.
Is this on? It's on. Hi, my name is Karen Raz, and I'm a Reynolds Fellow from the law school.
Great.
I really enjoyed the speech, and this might go to your last duality point, but one of the many challenges I've found social entrepreneurs face is they have an incredible vision, but it's one thing to have the vision, and it's another to be able to execute it and implement it on the ground in reality. I guess my question is, what do you see in social entrepreneurs that help them make that jump, and what problems do you see recur with those who really struggle with that jump?
Yep, I think that's a really good point, Karen, and congratulations on being a Reynolds Fellow. We see it all the time. And, you know, Echoing Green, you know, we're angel investors in the social sector, so we give first funding. So when our fellows come to us, there's very little there. So essentially all we're investing in that person. We're investing in the talent, we're investing in the vision, and in many cases the execution comes later. So I do think that's right. I mean, you get some fellows who are as visionary as they are proficient in executing on that vision. And those are the easy ones. You just get out of the way and you let them go. I think most of us sort of lie, you know, somewhere on either side of that, where we're really good with the vision, not so great on the execution. I think a couple things happen. I think number one, you go to a dinner party with social entrepreneurs, and it's the most intense an interesting evening you'll ever spend, because all they want to do is talk about their work and they're so focused on it. And that intensity, and I will say that blessed obsession covers a multitude of sins. So these folks who may not be great at executing, it sort of doesn't almost matter, because they will get it done. They'll stay up till 3 in the morning. They'll talk to anybody who will listen and gather those resources to help them get it done. And it is amazing to watch them get through it. So the passion, again, pulls through on the execution where the execution may be lacking. But I think increasingly, and Gabe talked about this, there's a real recognition, especially some social entrepreneurs who are starting to get to scale in terms of growth and replication, that in fact, if you don't get that human capital support piece right, if you don't get that COO into your organization, if you don't get that chief technology officer in, you're in trouble. Because you can be a great visionary, but again, if you can't execute at scale and at pace, it is meaningless. So again, I think that's sort of an interesting trend that we're seeing, is that a lot of these social entrepreneurs are now, opening up their organizations and saying, I'm really good at the vision stuff, but I need a team to help me execute. And again, I'll refer back to Forces for Good, because one of the lessons that they noted, what makes a great nonprofit great, it was a deep bench of talent, really important. So, hi.
Hi. Hello. Hi. My name is Claudia Perez-Felicer. I'm actually a 2008 Reynolds Scholar.
Hey.
Yay.
Love the Reynolds Fellows. Great.
I actually had a question about, I really appreciate your metaphor that you used with the butterfly. And I had a question relating to that. The idea, one image that we see reoccurring is that we have the one lone wolf visionary of the social entrepreneur. And I wanted to ask if you could speak to sort of the importance of setting up the network and a cohesive team of entrepreneurs worldwide. And if perhaps you could identify movements that you identify that you've seen that are working around the world.
That's a great question, Claudia. It was funny, a couple weeks ago I was down in Austin, Texas, at the Clinton Global Initiative University, so CGI for young people. And I did a panel on, was it developing your organization, starting your organization? And literally I spent the 45 minutes saying, please don't start an organization. I beg of you, please don't start. So I'm sure they were sorry they invited me, because I came and I know these young people were ready, like, what do I need to learn? And I said, it's not about the organization. And I think that has been the worrisome side of social entrepreneurship, that again, through narrative, the power of narrative, we raise up these individuals, and the measure of success becomes that person who starts that organization. And that's just the wrong message. And I think it happens because they're such powerful storylines, and you're so drawn to them, that one of the sad externalities is everyone takes away from it. Ooh, I got to start an organization. But I think once you start to dig deep, all of these social entrepreneurs, I think, would never ever subscribe and would push back against that lone wolf, that great man of history theory. And when you look at their work and how it's being played out in their communities every day, it is absolutely in the context of a broader community network, which some people called, co-opetition, the importance of collaboration, the importance of alliance. Because they're in the business of movement building, they already understand that if it's just them alone, if they're just an island of excellence, it will fail. They understand that, again, being resource magnets means bringing your allies and others, and even those across sector, into your larger struggle and your larger movement. So I almost think to a man and woman, they really do perceive themselves in this movement building, this systems framework. It's just when it gets translated for public consumption, it's the stories that make people's hearts sing. So again, I think our industry has to do a better job of, once you get past the inspiration and the motivation, start saying, guys, it's about networks. It's about cross-sector collaboration. And I think what we're seeing in the field now is this next wave of sort of open innovation technology. How do you use open innovation platforms to bring various ideas in? How do people cross-talk all over the world to solve common problems? I'm really interested to see how that plays out, because I think that open innovation platform will be a really great way to network even larger numbers of people working towards social change. So,
thank you.
Thanks.
Hello, my
Hi.
name is Farhad, and for the sake of being authentic, I'm not an NYU fellow, I kind of snuck in.
Yeah, great, love that. Opportunistic, that's great.
But as far as my question, I think I just finished reading A World Without Poverty by Muhammad Yunus, and I feel like every book I pick up, there's reference to Muhammad Yunus, and with Bill Gates, his recent essay last year, as far as creative capitalism, and seeing the transition that's happening. I think it's a lot different than 1991 when you got into I feel like there's a binary culture where can you have compassion and capitalism at the same time? And can you use the forces of capitalism, which is the greatest force, to bring about this change? And you have now B corporations and all of these for-profit entities that have the scrutiny and the vigilance to create a bottom line.
Yes.
And to link that with the compassion and the belief in a social good of a for-profit. And you're seeing that sprout up. And with Echoing Green, the focus is more so on the nonprofit. And with Ashoka and all these other, the Skull Foundation or the Schwab Foundation, it's more of a focus on the nonprofit. And I think through Muhammad Yunus's idea of no loss company and through creative capitalism, I think there's a power to that can stretch, you know, and move this much faster. So what are your feelings on that?
I love that. Thank you for that, because I spent all weekend rereading Bill Gates's, he gave that talk at Davos at the World Economic Forum last year talking about creative capitalism, conscious capitalism. And I can't tell how I feel about it yet. So on the one hand, you know, again, I was funded close to 20 years by Echoing Green, and everybody who was coming down the pike, we were all starting traditional nonprofits. You know, you wrote grants, you used philanthropic capital, that's how you did your work. Last year, fully 20% of the applications to Echoing Green were either for-profit social enterprises or hybrid models, which is fascinating. So again, I talked about Vikram Kula. When Vikram got his Echoing Green Fellowship, he started SKS as a nonprofit, but a few years ago, he translated SKS into a for-profit. He got VC money from Sequoia, from Vinod Khosla. He's going to take SKS public in the next couple of years. So I do think it is a wonderful trend where young people like you are looking at these sort of artificial boundaries that my generation and others created between the for-profit world, the business world, and the government. Like, they're exploding those boundaries. And they're like, I don't care what tool I use to get change done. I will use whatever I need to do to get it done. So I love the notion of B Corp, by the way, started by one of our board members, Andrew Kasoy. Low-profit corporations, talking to this young man who started Pure Project, which is looking at the L3C. I love this trend. I think it's really very exciting, and I think it is the wave of the future. The one thing I will say, though, and I've been spending a lot of time thinking about this, in part of this sort of strategic realignment process with Echoing Green, when you sit down and you look at all of our fellows, again, some do the arts, some do healthcare, some do, you know, economic justice, across all of their work is this underlying notion that they are in the business of unleashing the full human potential of their constituents and their customers. And it is about the social value that they are trying to unleash in particular systems. And I think capitalism can do some of that, but at the end of the day, it's always about driving towards economic value. So I think sort of the work that, you know, conscious capitalism and Bill Gates is talking about, you're actually talking about a nice externality that comes from the regular business of the capitalist enterprise. I think that's great because it is the biggest engine, well, until recently, was the biggest engine of our society. Again, I just think social entrepreneurship and groups like Echoing Green, though, are sitting on something else. You know, what if we could monetize and really think about the economics of human potential, a full human potential? How about unleashing full social value there? Because again, I think the wonderful externality there is economic value as well. So I'm spending a lot of time thinking about it and reading about it, and I think this is a conversation that we're going to be having for the next couple of years. But I am all for these new models because I think you got to throw everything against the wall, and I'm always for more more resources, more attention to the work of social change. But it's very interesting. I totally agree with you.
To that note, this will be my last thing. I know there's a lot of Obama fans here, and he may potentially be the greatest social entrepreneur. And I just read an article on my way here, and there's a quote in there that I want to read to everyone, which I found just amazing. He refers to MLK, and it says, "The strong man holds a living blend of strongly marked opposites. The idealists are usually not realistic, and the realists are not usually idealistic. Seldom are the humble self-assertive and the self-assertive humble. But life at its best is a creative synthesis of opposites living together in fruitful harmony." And I
totally have to get that quote from you. I love that, love that, love that. I thank you for that, and I agree with you, and I'm very excited about what the Obama administration has proposed in terms of social innovation. And look, Mrs. Obama, a social entrepreneur herself, she was the founding executive director of Public Allies, another group seeded by Echoing Green. So I think this is a wonderful time for our field. So thank you. That was a great quote.
Thanks. I'm Jane Lewicki-Zuka, also Reynolds Fellow 2007.
Hi, Jane. Great.
Just to push this a little bit further, and I guess it sort of picks up on that quote, but I wondered if you could say a little bit more about the sort of challenges and prospects for social entrepreneurship within government, beyond running for president kind of thing. You mentioned the really interesting examples about the University for Public Service and also the sort of green jobs move into the government, but if you want to slug it out within government, and we also have this wonderful public service school here at NYU, what do you think some of the either specific qualities or challenges or opportunities there are to work within public service in the most traditional sense within government?
A great question. These are really good questions. So a couple of things. I think it's a very interesting time for a whole host of reasons for the field of social entrepreneurship. But when you sort of look at sort of the founding leadership and some of the core tenets of social entrepreneurship, in many ways, one of the founding principles was government can't do it. So we, the social entrepreneur, have got to do it. We step in where they fail, and we will go around government. And that's sort of been our, one of our guiding forces. Is government bad? They're inefficient. They're ineffective. They're not going to do it. We will do it. Well, that is starting to change in this field. So you had social entrepreneurs who were toiling in the private sector, who were loath to at all get anywhere near the government as partner or as funding source. But again, especially as a lot of these social entrepreneurs are scaling and trying to grow, there came that aha moment that the greatest source of growth capital is the government. Literally 60 cents out of every dollar the government spends is related, that the nonprofit spends either comes from the government as through contract, or through tax breaks and other things. So the government and the nonprofit sector are inexorably linked. They are just partners. And the question is, once you admit that and realize, how can you make that relationship more effective and more efficient? And something we've seen the past couple of years, I had one politician, one lobbyist say, Congress people don't know a heck of a lot about social entrepreneurs because they never show up at their offices. So we hear from every other constituency, unless you come talk to me, how do I know what you do, what you stand for? So I think, social entrepreneurs have to step up, get engaged, understand the process. So it's interesting, especially in the Echoing Green community, especially among our veteran social entrepreneurs, those who are running bigger organizations, who are looking to the government for funding, they've had to really educate themselves on how do you navigate the public policy process, how do you work with lobbyists to get your issues on the table, how do you work effectively with the government at state, regional, and national level. So again, I think this is the beginning of a new conversation. And for us to continue to thrive, and again, Obama's call, he talked about this idea of catalytic government. The government, he says, it's not that our problems are too big, it's that our solutions are too small. And why he looked to social entrepreneurs saying, government is not going to solve these problems, but we can create a good policy, an accommodating policy environment to let you guys do what you do best. And I take him at his word, and that his administration's word, that if they could build this policy environment, if they could get out of the way and be an effective partner to let groups that are doing this work well already do it better, I think it could be a powerful combination. And the last thing I will say is that I do think increasingly social entrepreneurs, when everybody's sort of blurring boundaries, moving between sectors, social entrepreneurs should really think about spending some time in the public sector. You guys have long careers ahead of you. Your president has called you to serve. I think it would be terrific if more took the time to understanding the innards of the policy and governmental process, because I think until you're in it and really understand the nuts and bolts of it, you can't be an effective consumer of those services unless you really understand it. So I'm actually quite hopeful that more and more social entrepreneurs are starting to realize that government is not the enemy. You don't have to necessarily always hold it at arm's length, but you can work with it in effective, efficient ways. So I think I'm optimistic at this point.
Hi.
Hi.
I understand how your model is different than Ford Foundation, Rockefeller, Atlantic Philanthropies, but is there a way, or are your grant makers or grant making process different than theirs?
Yes, and I will say, I'll focus on one point. Well, I mean, look, we got very little money compared to a lot of those big guns. You know, we're a fund, so we have to, first of all, go out and raise the money that we give out every year, and it's exhausting and it's grueling, but I think it also keeps us honest and keeps us responsive to the marketplace. So we've got to go out every year and sell our wares to the philanthropic community. And unless you can make your case of why you deserve resources versus another group, I think it makes you really have to hustle and be very good at what you do. So, you know, spending 80% of my time raising money, it's really tough, but again, you have to be really thoughtful and secure in your model for change. But I think the greatest difference between sort of the more traditional philanthropists and organizations like Echoing Green, and this is one reason I love Echoing Green so much, is that it completely flips the power dynamic between funder and social entrepreneur. Foundations, for the most part, have a particular view of the world, and you as the grantee have got to come into their office and explain how you fit into their view of the world. Echoing Green would never do that. Echoing Green says there's no way that we know your world and your community better than you could and can as the indigenous leader. So it is our job to sit back and learn from you, and if you can make the case of why you need this funding and why your model for you know, this new inflection point in your movement, if you make the case to us, we will fund you, and we will always defer to you as the knowledgeable partner in that relationship. And you know, it may seem a little nebulous, but I cannot understate the importance of that simple flip in the power dynamic. I think it's one of the reasons Echoing Green and social entrepreneurial organizations are so good at what they do.
Looking ahead, what do you think are the trends that would happen in the field of social entrepreneurship over, say, the next 5 to 10 years?
Yep. Again, what we were talking about earlier, I think this notion of social enterprise, I think you'll see more blurring between the traditional not-for-profit, a hybrid organization that may have an earned income strategy, to the social enterprise with double bottom line, triple bottom line investing. I'm actually really interested and excited about that. And I think, again, as the young man was talking about, and that you're working on with Pure Project and B Corp, I think this is a really important trend to watch. And I think it's an important, it's particularly important because one of the fundamental struggles is this notion of nonprofit sustainability. You know, there are 1.5 million nonprofits in this country. The vast majority, 94% are under $250,000 budget per year. We are tiny. These organizations are undercapitalized. You spend all your time trying to raise money, and the sustainability question is really tough. So I do think there's something there in this struggle to better harness market forces to get done what we need to get done. So I think that's a really important trend. You know, and maybe I see this as a trend because I've been working on it so deeply for the past couple of months. This whole question of the definition of scale. You know, there is one wing of the social entrepreneurship field that equates and conflates scale with growth, budget size, and replication sites. There's another camp, and for full disclosure, I'm in this other camp, that thinks scale is more diverse than that, and you could be equally impactful staying in one community going deep as you can in 15 communities going wide, and that, you know, how do we start to really define, and ultimately what we're all trying to get to is impact. So how in the world are we ultimately going to get to some impact measures? And this is something, in fact, you know, I was writing a memo the other night. You know, a lot of really small but good social entrepreneurial groups get left out of funding because a lot of these venture philanthropists are so fixated on metrics and you know, impact. But you confuse data from impact measures. Data is much easier to get than impact measures are. So I think the field has really got to grapple with how do you start to measure impact in a credible way, and in a way that doesn't privilege those groups who are able to just hire a good evaluator and then have good technology systems. I think that's another big question that we're going to have to grapple with in the next couple of years. And again, nobody has figured out how to measure social return on investment in a really good way. So I'd say those are two trends.
Hi, and thank you for your work and your talk. I'm Bayla Wolf with the Eastside Institute. You spoke of sustainable behavioral change as a critical factor in whether something is going to really be effective or not. So how do you see the issue of human development?
Yeah, well, great question, Baylor. Thank you. And I love these questions because we're actually grappling with them in real time as we go through our latest strategic planning process. And I will refer back to the work of my colleagues Laura and Anthony and Mayland. Echoing Green self-published a book a couple of years ago called Be Bold, where we took the stories of 12 of our social entrepreneurs and essentially put it together in a short career guide for young people. So it was like, here are the stories of people from, Wendy Kopp from Teach for America to Michael Brown, co-founder of City Year, to Carolyn Lau from Gay Straight Alliance. And we just sort of started to tease out some of the qualities and characteristics that made them them. And I think out of this process, and Laura's in the process with her team of working on a second Be Bold book, she gave me a real aha moment, was that, Echoing Green, in the world of social entrepreneurship is most closely aligned with younger social entrepreneurs because we're first funders. Most of the people who apply to us are between 25 and 30, things like that. That it is in that process of career exploration and formation that you've got a real ability to influence the values formation, the identity formation of these young people, and that human development, you sort of march along it. But for us, by really zeroing in on that career formation process and phase, we believe that by helping to influence and helping these young people think about their identities in particular ways, we could potentially create, millions and millions of change agents who are not, starting their organizations, but who are at Goldman Sachs being terrifically engaged citizens, or someone who goes to work as a COO in a social entrepreneurial organization. So again, from our perspective, it's the career formation process that we think is the key to influencing the way a lot of young people live their lives. And there's psychology data called the most influential age hypothesis, that if you get at them in the late teens, early 20s, you set those preferences for life. So that's what we're thinking a lot about.
So then just to continue, how do you think about, let's say you fund something in the Congo or whatever, how do you think about sustainable behavioral change among the people that are being worked with to develop them and develop their communities?
Yeah, again, I think that's the work of our social entrepreneurs, but I think embedded within all of their models is sort of a ground-up approach that you have to work in concert with your constituents. And that, again, I think the model is all change happens from bottom up by giving people a real, tangible role to play in solving their community problems and allowing them to have a seat at the table. That's the only way you get at sustained behavioral change in particular communities.
I couldn't agree with you more. Just to say that the Eastside Institute uses performance as a tool to help people create development in their communities.
Absolutely.
And we bring together people twice a year once every 2 years from all over the world who are using performance to develop their community.
I think that's great.
Thank you,
Baylor. Appreciate that. Hi.
Hi, thank you. Fascinating talk. I think this might be moot because I feel like you've touched on some of these points a little bit, but one of the things that often concerns me, and I'm sure many people, about the proliferation of the non-profit sector is that this kind of question of sustainability and the issue that, as you were saying, all these people feeling they need to go off and set their own organizations. So how, obviously you're in the business of doing that, but how is it that Echoing Green kind of ensures that these movements don't become atomized? They're built into the communities they're in, they become parts of systems, and that there's a real accountability to constituencies, and that people are kind of entrepreneurship in the place you're in, as opposed to having to break away.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree with you. Great question, and we grapple with that all the time. Again, as I mentioned, 1.4, 1.5 million nonprofits. It's ridiculous. This whole sector is balkanized. Most of these organizations are duplicative, inefficient. We're all fighting for limited resources. Paul Light, a professor here at NYU, did a recent article saying that he anticipated that in this economic downturn, we'll probably lose 100,000 to 150,000 nonprofits just because a lot of us will not be able to sustain. That is both worrying and I think both an opportunity and a crisis, because I think, merger, closure for some, actually not a bad thing, and we should use this very difficult moment to sort of to merge, to collaborate, to build alliances. So that's the first thing I'll say. I think the other thing is what I spoke about earlier, this concern about, you just keep creating these little islands of excellence. To what end? That is a real problem. And I think Echoing Green tries to hedge its bet by the type of entrepreneur that we select. In my remarks, I said, we are looking for a particular type of social entrepreneur that I'm calling a social movement, social entrepreneur, or a movement conscious entrepreneur, someone who comes to the table already steeped in that larger movement, and who just brings that framework to the table that they are part of something larger, and that they know that they are not a lone wolf out there doing it. So in some ways, I think you have to rely on that indigenous leader to bring that perspective to the table. I'm not sure you can always teach it. In some ways, I think you have it or you don't. And we are in the business of trying to identify those people who have that level of consciousness and try to get them at that inflection point where they've now seen a fork in the road of their movement, or they've created the fork and they're just trying to get out there. So again, I think it's a way of walking through the world. I really do think you have it or you don't, and I think you're most successful when you have that movement-based feel to the work that you do. So we do the best we can. We try to do it, again, using this behavioral lens of what we think a movement-conscious social entrepreneur looks like. But it's not always easy. And I hope, in this economic downturn where we all have to do more with less, couldn't we actually use this opportunity to come together and collaborate and use, this time to do some things together when just a couple of years ago we all would have gone it alone. So.
Hi, my name is Ali Atai. I am from, I did not sneak in like my brother. I am a pediatric dentist who practices I practice in Queens, and I also am an executive public health student at Columbia. And I thank you very much. Thank you very much for flipping the power switch, for creating an opportunity for people to bring their paradigm into what it is, that the change that they need. But what I'm most concerned about is that you talk about the early mortality, infant mortality rate.
Yep.
I'm dealing with a very similar sort of thing where 80% of the dental caries is in 20% of the children. If you look at 4 and under, 90% of the cavities are in 5% of the poorest children.
Yep.
Right here in New York City. And that difference is between just a few subway stops between Upper East Side and Bronx, or Forest Hill, Queens, and Corona, Queens.
Yep.
And I speak to my residents at Mount Sinai, where I teach, and I try to empower them to see that you can do better. And they're already so burdened by the system that has brought them this far that or maybe I'm not just doing a good enough job to try and convince them to see, you can go out there and do something different. But no, they're just already too burdened. And I think that you spoke about a lot of fellows here. By the time you're an NYU law student or undergrad or whatever in NYU, even maybe you'll get to snuck in. Your brother has to be somebody for you to be able to snuck in, maybe even. You're already very greatly burdened. And I find that there's still a lot of talent out there that doesn't even get to come to the surface. Those critical ages that you talked about, 18, 20, they never even get there. And the greatest ideas are there because they are the ones that know.
Yep.
And what are the mechanisms that we need to put into place to find those people, and before they've given up and not ever been able to go to NYU or whatever and have had their second kid already, get them, because they're creative, they're just as capable. It doesn't mean anything that they don't have an NYU degree.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree with you more. I think that is so important. And I will, I'll flip the switch on you one more time. And you talked about the burden, and I felt that as a pediatric resident. I was exhausted all the time. You saw these, horrific family situations coming into the emergency room, and you're like, oh my God, what can I do? But I would flip the switch from a burden to an opportunity. If not you, then who? It is our responsibility. We talk about the moment of obligation. I look at it as a blessed obligation. We've been given so much, and we have a platform to help. And again, I think your best and highest use in many ways is the example you set for your patients and for the families that you see. And again, I think it's your responsibility to stand as that example. But the other thing I will say, though, is you're right, because again, those solutions all live within those communities you serve. And this is where I think the power of service matters. And you talk about, Tom Brokaw talks about the greatest generation, and part of it was because millions and millions of, mostly young men, but women as well, had the opportunity to serve, and there is something transformative in that experience. And a lot of us get to that transformation because of military service, because of the life that we lead, some crisis, our ethnic background, our socioeconomic condition, that we are exposed, and it somehow transforms us in some way. I think to get many more young people especially engaged, we've got to create those avenues for service, because it is in that process of service that you're going to flip some of them, most of them, and that's all you need. You just need enough of them to flip. That's all you need.
But I think the biggest problem is that the incubators, just like you mentioned, the public policy incubators for developing public policy leadership, the incubators for those young people are just too artificially expensive.
Yeah.
I think it's just unacceptable that is what it takes to be able to develop these promising individuals.
Right.
They're too inflexible, and it's just very inflexible. And it's a very huge debt by the economic cost.
No, I couldn't agree with you more, but I will say, Echoing Green has funded folks who didn't finish high school, didn't have a college degree, to a lot of folks who did have the privilege of terrific educations. But I think it's not about a part of it is how do you leverage the community college system, which is the main education force for most people of color in this country. I think they have an incredible role to play. How do you bolster the community college system to create these opportunities, because I think they're great stepping stones for learning and service. But then again, how in communities do you create those service opportunities independent of academic institutions? I think that's how we have to think of it. I agree with you on that.
We have just about 2 or 3 minutes.
All right.
You both say your questions, not the exact time.
Okay, thank you so much. So I would say I've definitely been inspired by a spirit of service, and in fact transitioned from a 20-year career in financial services, project portfolio management, and now I am the Sustainable Building Project Director for the Patterson Habitat for Humanity.
Great, congratulations.
Many moments of obligation, thank you, in my life, and I think one of them is reading the World Watch Institute report about the urban movement, and really looking out my own window and seeing, well, what's there, what is my urban community, literally less than a mile, and what does it need? And so I guess just interesting that you inferred but didn't really mention with respect to SEQ, and maybe even with respect to bringing more people, more resources to the table, is the spirit of gratitude. And in particular, gratitude as a motivating force to obligate people or necessitate that everybody takes some kind of response. And even back to the comment the woman made before about sustainable behavior, it's a lot easier for me to sustain behavior because I'm fed and I have a home and I have a decent education under my belt. So that type of spirit I'd love to comment more on. As we look up Maslow's hierarchy of needs, how do you get to the top when your base is not even there?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
That's a really good point. I couldn't have said it any better myself, and I think that's really an incredible point. And I think something, the interplay of spirituality and faith, this is independent of religion, but the role of faith that gets played out in a lot of this work, I think is a really rich source of further exploration that Echoing Green, I hope, will look into, because I think you've hit the nail on the head. And again, I think you see that across the board with all of our fellows. I couldn't agree with your point more. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Cheryl. I just have a quick question. I'm really fascinated with this SEQ model and how it kind of relates to, or is somewhat similar to IQ. And from my understanding, IQ is something rigid. You just have a number, and there's nothing you can do about it. It's just like your mental horsepower.
Yep.
So in your opinion, how possible is it to change your SEQ?
It's a great question, Jerry. And Jerry is a 2008 Coro Fellow, and is actually interning, spending the month with us as a Coro Fellow. So in fact, that's one of the things you're going to work on the next month, Jerry, because it's a great question. So this is his second day with us. And Coro is a great organization. It's a really wonderful leadership development program. So thank you, Jerry. I actually think you're right. And it's a really interesting point. In the Outliers book, Malcolm Gladwell does a whole section on this famous, I can't remember the scientist's name, who's known for studying IQ and how he tracked people with really high IQs over decades to see how their lives turned out. And I do think it is not a rigid standard. I actually do think that people will exhibit various degrees of these qualities. Some will be really high on the SEQ scale, others will be less so. And more importantly, I think you can probably teach up to some of these qualities. I don't think it's nature nurture. I think most of this stuff in here, there are probably tools, resources, reflection opportunities that can sort of move you up the chain or the hierarchy of SEQ. And again, we're just at the beginning of figuring it out, but my fundamental hypothesis is it is not static. We are not either in the game or out of the game. We can all sort of dial up our level of SEQ, and I think it's then incumbent upon Equine Green and other entities about what are the exercises and tools and products that we can provide to help people who want to take that journey. So we'll work on it together over the next 28 days. That's great. Thank you very much.